Life at sea in the age of sail was governed by rules as unforgiving as the ocean itself. Ships were floating worlds where survival depended on order, discipline, and unquestioning obedience to authority. Sailors lived in cramped conditions, often half-starved, constantly exposed to disease, storms, and violence. But beyond the natural dangers of the sea, men also lived under the constant threat of punishment. Among the most feared of these punishments was keelhauling, a brutal form of naval discipline that combined terror, pain, and public spectacle in one horrifying act, the very word itself. Keelhauling conjures images of bodies dragged beneath hulking ships, scraping against barnacles, lungs filling with seawater, as shipmates watched in silence. To understand its cruelty, one must imagine the conditions of the keel of a wooden ship. Over time, the submerged surfaces became encrusted with barnacles, razor-sharp shells, seaweed, and hardened growths. Forcing a man beneath this surface was not only to risk drowning but also to guarantee that his skin would be shredded raw. And yet, in certain navies, this was considered an acceptable form of punishment, a way of keeping order, when the stakes of disobedience were nothing less than the survival of the entire crew. Historical records point most strongly to the Dutch Navy of the 17th century as the place where keelhauling became both formalized and infamous. Maritime codes from the Netherlands describe the process in chillingly direct terms, and sailors' diaries reveal the fear that even rumors of the punishment could inspire. Yet the idea of dragging a condemned man beneath the keel of a ship may not have been uniquely Dutch. References appear across Europe in French and English maritime accounts, in whispers from pirate crews, and in reports by diplomats who describe the terror as a cautionary tale. Whether it was truly common or more symbolic, it left its mark on naval memory, searing itself into the collective imagination of those who lived and died at sea. The process itself was as calculated as it was cruel. A sailor condemned to keelhauling was typically stripped down and tied with ropes, sometimes weighted to prevent him from fighting against the water's pull. One rope was fixed to one side of the ship, the other drawn beneath the keel to the opposite side. When the order was given, the man was thrown into the sea and dragged beneath the massive wooden hull. He could be pulled quickly, minimizing but not eliminating the injuries, or slowly, a deliberate prolonging of agony. If barnacles shredded him badly, his body might surface bloody and broken. If the crew pulled too slow or the sailor's body snagged against the growths under the ship, drowning was inevitable. There are accounts that differentiate between two outcomes. Sometimes the punishment was meant to kill, other times it was intended as a lesson. In cases where commanders wished to preserve the sailor's life, he might be hauled quickly, perhaps multiple times, leaving him coughing up seawater, gashed and terrified but alive. In more severe cases, it was almost a form of execution, the ship itself becoming the instrument of death. Survivors bore scars not just on their bodies but on their spirits, marked as examples of what defiance against naval authority could bring. One striking feature of keelhauling was its public nature. This was never a private punishment administered out of sight. Entire crews were ordered to gather and watch. The sight of a man disappearing beneath the waterline, his fate uncertain until he surfaced on the other side, served as a powerful deterrent. Sailors knew well what barnacles could do to their hands during simple ship maintenance. To imagine an entire body scraped across them was enough to quell rebellion or discourage theft. The water itself became a stage, the punishment both a warning and a spectacle, calculated to remind sailors of the absolute power held by their captains and admirals. Surviving documents emphasize how naval authority depended on maintaining strict codes of conduct. Mutiny, desertion, theft, and cowardice could unravel discipline and endanger entire voyages. At sea, one man's disobedience could doom hundreds. Harsh punishment was not only about cruelty but about control. The ship was a microcosm of the state, and the captain was its law. If the men feared the law more than the enemy or the storm, then order could be maintained. Keelhauling was the embodiment of this principle, the sea itself used as both prison and executioner. The ship transformed into a floating scaffold. Yet while the Dutch are most often associated with keelhauling, tales of its use filtered through other naval traditions. English sailors whispered of it. Though the British Royal Navy left fewer direct records of its practice, French sources mention it. In passing, and pirates, whose codes of discipline were often both brutal and improvisational, may have adopted or exaggerated the punishment. Over time, the idea of keelhauling became larger than the reality, transforming into a story told in port taverns, a threat used by captains, and eventually a legend passed into naval folklore. What makes keelhauling particularly chilling is the mixture of its ambiguity and its undeniability. On one hand, scholars debate how widespread the practice actually was. Some argue that it may have been more threatened than carried out, a terrifying legend reinforced by a few documented cases. Others insist that records and punishments at sea were notoriously underreported, and that keelhauling may have been a grim reality more common than we would like to imagine. The truth likely lies somewhere between. While not routine, it was certainly real enough to have been feared, remembered, and recorded. Imagining the perspective of a sailor facing this punishment is harrowing. To be bound and lowered into the sea, staring up at the massive hull of the ship, your home, your prison, your instrument of destruction, must have been terrifying beyond measure. The cold water shocking the body, the ropes cutting into wrists and ankles, the desperate instinct to breathe clashing with the choking floods of seawater, and then the scraping, the tearing of skin against hard barnacles, the sharp pain giving way to numbness as panic overtook the senses. For those dragged multiple times, the suffering was repeated, an ordeal that broke down the body until consciousness itself became the final escape. The horror of keelhauling lies not only in its physical cruelty, but in its symbolic weight. It showed that at sea, a man's life could be consumed by the very vessel that carried him, punished by the waters that sustained him, destroyed by the community that once depended on him. In a world where sailors often lived close to death from disease, storms, and battle, keelhauling was a reminder that the worst fate could come not from nature or the enemy, but from your own commander's hand. This, then, was the terror of keelhauling, a punishment that blurred the line between discipline and execution, between myth and reality, between survival and spectacle. It was an act designed to crush rebellion before it started, to imprint obedience in the minds of sailors, and to harness the ocean's indifference as a weapon of command. The legacy of keelhauling did not end with the 17th century, but its place in history became more shadow than substance, more legend than widespread practice. As navies across Europe evolved, punishments shifted with them, but the specter of being dragged beneath the keel remained a haunting reminder of what absolute authority could demand. For the Dutch, who left the clearest documentary evidence, keelhauling remained on their naval books for decades, formally codified as an option for captains facing insubordination, desertion, or mutiny. The fact that it was written into law, not merely whispered in rumor, proves that the punishment was no invention. It was deliberately crafted, ritualized, and sanctioned as a method to keep fragile discipline intact on long, dangerous voyages. But while the Dutch codified it, other navies seemed to weave it into their lore differently. English seamen certainly spoke of it, though their navy favored flogging, hanging, or marooning as routine punishments. French records mention it in passing, suggesting it was at least known, if not fully embraced. By the 18th century, keelhauling became more of a threat in the captain's arsenal than a punishment commonly inflicted. Commanders could invoke it with a single phrase, and the crew's imaginations would do the rest. For men who scrubbed barnacles from a ship's belly, who saw their hands torn open in the process, the very thought of being scraped beneath was enough to induce dread. The practice's effectiveness, then, lay as much in psychological terror as in physical brutality. Naval life was already punishing, with lashings, reduced rations, and confinement forming a grim spectrum of discipline. Keelhauling represented the far end of that spectrum, a punishment so severe that it required little demonstration to enforce order. Once a single sailor had been hauled beneath and emerged a bloodied wreck, or not at all, the lesson could resonate for years. Even generations carried from one crew to another in stories retold by firelight or in smoky taverns along the docks. The cruelty of keel hauling becomes clearer when viewed alongside the broader culture of naval discipline. At sea, the balance of power was absolute. Captains were monarchs on water, entrusted with the lives of their crews and the fortunes of their nations. In this rigid hierarchy, obedience was not negotiable. A moment's hesitation in battle, a whispered conspiracy of mutiny, or a theft that eroded trust could unravel everything. Extreme punishments reflected extreme necessity, at least in the eyes of those who wielded authority. Keel hauling, then, symbolized the oceanic world's most desperate demand: submission at any cost. Over time, though, the tide turned against such extremes. As naval organization modernized in the 18th and 19th centuries, bureaucracies and state oversight began to limit the unrestrained violence captains once exercised. More humane, or at least more regulated, systems of punishment emerged. Flogging remained brutal, but it was standardized. Executions were rare, reserved for mutiny or desertion in wartime. And keel hauling, with its reputation for savagery and its ambiguity between torture and execution, fell out of favor. The punishment faded from active use, leaving behind a residue of stories, half documented, half feared. By the 19th century, keel hauling had crossed from practice into legend. It appeared in sailors' memoirs, in fictionalized adventure tales, and in the public imagination of maritime life. Writers of sea novels and dramatists of naval warfare used the image of a man dragged beneath the ship as a symbol of tyranny at sea. Pirates, in particular, became associated with it in later retellings, though whether they actually practiced it is questionable. The very idea, however, fit their reputation for brutality and spectacle, so the punishment was absorbed into pirate folklore. Yet scholars examining maritime history stress that keel hauling should not be dismissed as mere myth. The existence of Dutch legal codes confirming its reality prevents such an easy dismissal. Instead, it must be understood as a practice both real and exaggerated, applied sparingly but remembered vividly, amplified by its horror into something far greater than its numerical frequency. Much like other extreme punishments of the past, it was not the number of victims that mattered, but the depth of fear it created. The symbolic weight of keel hauling lingered long after it was abandoned. In many ways, it represented the darkest aspect of life at sea, the transformation of the ocean itself into an accomplice of punishment. The very element sailors depended on for livelihood became the instrument of terror. For men already half convinced that the sea was alive, mysterious, and merciless, this punishment blurred the line between natural and human cruelty. It suggested that the ship and the ocean could turn against you if you failed in your duties, that you could be consumed not by storm or battle, but by the very order meant to preserve you. Even today, keel hauling retains its hold on the imagination. Popular culture, from novels to films to video games, has resurrected the term as shorthand for the most brutal of maritime punishments. It carries with it the imagery of barnacle-encrusted hulls, drowning lungs, and broken bodies dragged against wood and steel. Historians continue to debate its precise use, but the debate itself testifies to its enduring fascination. A punishment half remembered, half feared, and wholly brutal. That is the legacy keel hauling left behind. Ultimately, keel hauling is remembered not for how many men endured it, but for what it represented. It crystallized the cruelty of command, the vulnerability of sailors, and the extremity of discipline in an unforgiving environment. It remains a reminder that life at sea was not just a struggle against nature, but against one's own comrades and commanders. The ship was safety and prison, livelihood and punishment, floating home and potential grave. Keel hauling captured the paradox in the most horrifying way possible. And so, in the final analysis, keel hauling survives as both fact and legend, a brutal tool of terror, that scarred history even if only a handful of sailors truly faced its ropes. The fear of it was as real as the practice itself, and that fear was enough to preserve order in a world where order was everything. Today, it stands as a chilling reminder of how power can use spectacle and suffering to control, and how even the boundless sea was once harnessed as a weapon of discipline. If you found this dive into the grim realities of naval history compelling, stay with us as we continue exploring the darkest punishments and most brutal practices from across the world as past. Subscribe, share, and keep following, because history holds countless more stories of cruelty, authority, and survival that demand to be remembered.